Here's what I want you to picture. You're sitting in ancient Greece around 475 BCE, and someone stands up and says, everything you've ever experienced, every change you've witnessed, every moment of time passing, every object you've seen move, all of it is a complete illusion. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally, an illusion. You'd think this person was out of their mind, right? But here's the thing. This person wasn't some mystical guru or religious prophet. This was Parmenides of Elea, and he arrived at this conclusion through pure logical reasoning, cold, hard, rational argument. And his logic was so tight, so rigorous that philosophers are still wrestling with it 2,500 years later. This is the birth of something extraordinary in human thought. Before Parmenides, philosophers asked questions like, what is the universe made of? Or, where did everything come from? Practical questions with practical answers. Water, fire, air, the boundless. But Parmenides asked something far more radical, far more disturbing. What does it even mean for something to exist? Think about that question for a second. Not what exists, but what is existence itself? When you say something is, what are you actually claiming? This might sound like semantic hair-splitting, but watch what happens when you take it seriously. Watch how this one question, pursued with absolute logical rigor, leads to conclusions that seem to demolish everything we think we know about reality. And here's what makes Parmenides so important. He's not just making wild claims. He's showing us something profound about the relationship between reason and experience, between what our minds tell us and what our senses show us. He's forcing us to choose, and that choice defines much of Western philosophy that follows. So buckle up. We're about to meet the philosopher who used logic to prove that change is impossible, and in doing so, changed philosophy forever. Let me tell you about this guy because understanding who Parmenides was helps us understand why his ideas hit philosophy like a philosophical earthquake. The Eleatic philosopher. Parmenides lived and worked in Elea, a Greek colony in southern Italy, what's now the heel of the Italian boot. This wasn't Athens. This wasn't the cultural center of the Greek world, but Parmenides made it into a philosophical powerhouse by founding what we call the Eleatic school. And this school became known for one thing: using pure reason to defend ideas that seem absolutely crazy when you first hear them. The timing matters too. We're talking early 5th century BCE, right when Greek philosophy is finding its feet, right when thinkers are starting to move beyond mythological explanations and toward rational inquiry. Parmenides is right there at this crucial transition, and he's about to push rational inquiry to its absolute limit, revolutionary inquiry. Here's what makes Parmenides genuinely revolutionary. He's the first philosopher to investigate the nature of existence itself. Not the nature of things that exist, the nature of existence as such, being with a capital B. His predecessors, the Milesians, guys like Thales and Anaximander, they asked, what is the fundamental stuff of reality? Water? Air? Some boundless substance? Those are great questions. But Parmenides is operating at a deeper level. He's asking, what are the necessary conditions for anything to exist at all? What does being mean? And what logical constraints does it impose on reality? This is the birth of metaphysics as a distinct philosophical discipline. Before Parmenides, you had natural philosophy, speculation about the physical world. After Parmenides, you have metaphysics, systematic inquiry into the fundamental nature of reality itself, using pure reason as the tool, pioneering logic. And this brings us to Parmenides' methodological revolution. He introduced deductive, a priori reasoning to philosophy. Let me break that down because it's crucial. A priori means prior to experience. Reasoning that doesn't depend on observing the world, but on analyzing concepts and following logical necessity. Parmenides says, I don't need to look at the world to tell you about reality. I can figure out what must be true just by thinking clearly about what existence means. This is a radical claim. He's saying reason alone, pure logical deduction, can reveal truths about reality that are more fundamental, more certain than anything our senses could ever show us. In fact, as we'll see, he's going to say that when reason and the senses conflict, reason wins, every time. This method, this trust in logical deduction, becomes absolutely foundational for Western philosophy. When Aristotle develops formal logic a century and a half later, he's building on groundwork Parmenides laid. When Descartes sits in his room and tries to deduce what must be true from pure reason alone, he's walking a path Parmenides pioneered. When modern philosophers analyze concepts and explore logical possibilities, they're using tools Parmenides first sharpened. Monistic vision. Finally, Parmenides founded a school emphasizing the unity and permanence of reality. This is monism, the view that reality is ultimately one, not many, against the apparent multiplicity we see around us. Millions of different objects, constantly changing, moving, interacting. Parmenides says no. Reality is one, unchanging, eternal, indivisible. Everything else, the flux, the change, the diversity, that's appearance, that's opinion, that's the deceptive testimony of the senses leading us astray. Now I know what you're thinking. This is insane. I can see change happening right now. I can see multiple objects. This is obviously wrong. And you know what? That's exactly what everyone in ancient Greece thought too. That's what most philosophers today think. But here's the thing. Parmenides doesn't care whether his conclusion sounds crazy. He cares whether his argument is valid. He cares whether the logic works. And the terrifying thing? The logic is really, really tight. That's why we're still talking about him. That's why Plato wrote an entire dialogue wrestling with Parmenides' arguments. That's why Aristotle had to develop new concepts, potentiality, actuality, to try to escape Parmenides' conclusions. That's why modern philosophers still debate whether he was onto something profound or whether there's a subtle flaw somewhere in his reasoning. Parmenides is the philosopher who showed us that if you follow logic rigorously enough, it can lead you to conclusions that seem to contradict everything you experience. And that creates a fundamental tension in philosophy. What do you do when reason and experience point in opposite directions? Who wins that fight? For Parmenides, the answer was clear. Reason wins. Always. And now we need to see how he got there, which means taking a very strange journey into the heart of his only surviving work, a philosophical poem that's part cosmic mythology, part rigorous logical argument, and entirely mind-bending. Okay, so here's where things get interesting and a little weird. Parmenides' only surviving work is a poem. Not a treatise, not a dialogue, but a hexameter poem written in the epic style of Homer. Now you might be thinking, wait, I thought this guy was all about rigorous logic and rational argument. Why is he writing poetry? Great question. And the answer tells us something important about the transition happening in Greek thought right at this moment. A mythic framework. The poem opens with this incredible image. The narrator, presumably Parmenides himself, is being carried in a chariot pulled by immortal horses, guided by the daughters of the sun. They're racing through the cosmos, passing through the gates that separate night and day. Guards stand at these gates, but the sun maidens sweet-talk them, and the gates swing open. The chariot passes through, and on the other side the narrator meets a goddess. And this goddess, she's not identified by name, but she represents divine wisdom, cosmic knowledge, truth itself. This goddess is going to reveal to him the nature of reality. Now, if you're familiar with ancient Greek culture, you recognize what Parmenides is doing here. He's borrowing the authority of epic poetry, the prestige of divine revelation. In a culture where Homer and Hesiod were the ultimate authorities, where knowledge came from the muses, Parmenides is packaging his radical philosophical ideas in a familiar, authoritative form. But, and this is crucial, the content is completely different. The goddess isn't telling him stories about the gods. She's not recounting mythological events. She's laying out a logical argument about the nature of existence. Parmenides is using the form of religious revelation to deliver rational philosophy. It's a brilliant rhetorical move. He's got one foot in the old world of myth and one foot in the new world of reason. Three-part structure. The poem has three distinct sections, and understanding this structure is key to making sense of what Parmenides is doing. First, there's the proem, that cosmic chariot journey I just described. This is the framing device, the mythic setup. It establishes authority and creates a sense of revelation, of accessing knowledge beyond normal human reach. The journey through the gates symbolizes the passage from ignorance to understanding, from the world of appearances to the realm of truth. Then we get to the heart of the poem, the section on reality, which the goddess calls aletheia, literally unconcealment or truth. This is where Parmenides lays out his core metaphysical argument. This is where he's going to prove through logical deduction that reality is eternal, unchanging, indivisible, and complete. This is the philosophical payload, the part that's going to blow minds for the next 2,500 years. Finally, there's a section on opinion called doxa, and this part is puzzling. After spending all this effort proving that change and plurality are impossible, that the sensory world is deceptive, Parmenides then proceeds to describe, in considerable detail, a cosmology of the physical world. He talks about the sun, moon, stars, the structure of the cosmos, how things seem to work in the world of appearances. Why would he do this? Scholars have debated this for centuries. Some think it's Parmenides showing what the best possible account of the deceptive world of appearances would look like. If you insist on believing your senses, here's the most coherent story you can tell. But remember, it's still just opinion, not truth. Others think he's demonstrating the limits of mortal understanding, showing how even the most sophisticated cosmology is still trapped in the realm of illusion. The philosophical revolution in poetic form. Here's what I want you to appreciate. Parmenides is writing at a hinge moment in human intellectual history. He's living in a culture where authoritative knowledge comes from poets inspired by the Muses, where Homer and Hesiod are the ultimate sources of wisdom. But he's pioneering a new kind of knowledge, philosophical knowledge based on logical argument, not divine inspiration. So he writes a poem, yes. But it's a poem where the goddess doesn't just tell him what's true, she gives him arguments. She says, here's the logical reasoning. Here's why it must be this way. Here are the only possible paths of inquiry. And here's why only one of them makes sense. The mythic form is the delivery system for rational content. It's like he's smuggling philosophy into culture disguised as the kind of wisdom people already respect. And once it's in, once people engage with the arguments, the form becomes less important than the content. By Plato's time, just a century or so later, philosophers are writing dialogues, not poems. By Aristotle's time, they're writing treatises. The mythic framework has been discarded. But Parmenides needed it. He needed that bridge from the old world to the new. The two ways. The goddess tells Parmenides there are only two possible paths of inquiry, two ways of thinking about reality. The way of truth, aletheia. What is, and it is impossible for it not to be. This is the path of reason, of logical necessity, of understanding reality as it truly is. The way of opinion, doxa. What is not, is, and it is necessary for it not to be. This is the path mortals walk, trusting their senses, believing in change and plurality and the evidence of their eyes. And here's the kicker. The goddess says the second path is completely wrong. Not just incomplete or imperfect, wrong. It's a path you cannot travel because you cannot think or speak about what is not. Non-being is literally unthinkable. This sets up the fundamental tension in Parmenides' philosophy. Reason tells us one thing, experience tells us another. And Parmenides makes a choice. Reason wins. The senses are deceptive. What we experience every day is illusion. Only what logic reveals is real. Now I know this sounds extreme. It is extreme. But before you dismiss it, before you say, obviously our senses show us reality, I want you to sit with this question. How do you know? How do you know your senses are reliable? How do you know the world you experience is the world as it truly is? Parmenides is saying, you can't know that from experience, because experience is exactly what's in question. You can only know it from reason, and reason tells us something very different from what experience suggests. All right, buckle up. We're about to enter the way of truth, and I promise you it's not what you expect. We're about to see how Parmenides uses pure logic to derive a vision of reality that makes the matrix look tame. This is it. This is where Parmenides makes his stand. This is the argument that's going to seem absolutely insane, until you realize how tight the logic is, and then it's going to seem even more insane because you can't easily escape it. Parmenides starts with one simple premise. What is not cannot exist or be conceived. Non-being is impossible. You can't think it. You can't speak about it. It's literally nothing. Seems reasonable enough, right? How could nothing exist? How could you think about what isn't there? But watch what Parmenides does with this premise. Watch how he uses it to derive four characteristics of reality that completely overturn everything we think we know. Eternal. Reality has no beginning or end. Let's start with time. Can being, reality, existence itself, can it have a beginning? Can it come into existence? Parmenides says no. Here's why. If being came into existence, what did it come from? It must have come from either being or non-being. But if it came from being, then it already existed, so it didn't really come into existence at all. And if it came from non-being, that's impossible because non-being is nothing and nothing can't produce something. Think about it. You can't get something from nothing. That's not just a practical limitation, it's a logical impossibility. Nothing has no properties, no causal powers, no capacity to do anything. So being can't have a beginning. Same logic applies to the end. Can being cease to exist? Can it pass away? No, because that would mean it goes into non-being. And non-being doesn't exist. There's nowhere for being to go. It can't become nothing because nothing isn't a place, isn't a state, isn't anything, so being is eternal. Not in the sense of lasting a really long time. Eternal in the sense of being outside time altogether. No past, no future, just an eternal now. Being simply is, with no beginning and no end. Indivisible. Reality has no parts. Can being be divided? Can it have parts, boundaries, internal structure? Parmenides says no. And here's the logic. If being had parts, there would have to be something separating those parts. There would have to be boundaries between them. But what could those boundaries be? They can't be being itself because then the parts aren't really separate, they're continuous. And they can't be non-being because non-being doesn't exist. There's no space between parts of being because that space would have to be either something, in which case it's just more being, or nothing, which is impossible. So being has no parts. It's not made of smaller components. It's not divisible into sections. It's a unified, continuous, indivisible whole. When Parmenides says being is one, he means radically, absolutely one. No internal differentiation, no structure, no complexity. This means, and I want you to really think about this, there can't be multiple things. There can't be you and me and the table and the chair as separate entities, because separation requires boundaries, and boundaries require something that is not being, and that's impossible. Unchanging. Reality has no motion. Now we get to the really counterintuitive part. Can being change? Can it move from one state to another? Parmenides says absolutely not. Here's the argument. What does change mean? Change means something that is one way becomes another way. The ice is solid, then it's liquid. The coffee is hot, then it's cold. You're young, then you're old. But look at what's happening in change. The old state, the ice being solid, the coffee being hot, you being young, that state is not anymore. It has ceased to be. It has gone into non-being. And we've already established that non-being is impossible. So change is impossible. The solid ice can't become liquid water, because that would require the solid state to cease to be, to become not solid, to enter non-being. And non-being doesn't exist. Every change you think you see, every motion, every transformation, every process is an illusion. Nothing is actually changing. Nothing can change. The universe is absolutely, perfectly static. I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, but I just watched my coffee cool down. I just saw the sun move across the sky. I'm literally aging as we speak. This is ridiculous. And Parmenides would say, yes, that's what your senses tell you. And your senses are lying. They're showing you appearance, not reality. Trust the logic, not your eyes. Complete reality has no void. Finally, is there empty space? Is there void, nothingness, gaps in reality? You can probably guess Parmenides' answer by now. Absolutely not. Empty space would be places where being is not. It would be non-being, and non-being doesn't exist. So the universe is a plenum, completely, perfectly full. There are no gaps, no empty spaces, no void. Being is continuous, unbroken, everywhere. You can't have being here and non-being there because there is no there where being is not. This means motion is doubly impossible. Not only can't things change states, as we just discussed, they can't move from place to place either, because that would require empty space to move into. And there is no empty space. The radical conclusion. Let me put this all together because the full picture is staggering. Reality is eternal. It never began, it will never end. It exists outside of time. Reality is indivisible. It has no parts, no structure, no internal differentiation. Reality is unchanging. Nothing ever moves, nothing ever transforms, nothing ever becomes different. Reality is complete. There is no void, no empty space, no gaps. Reality is one, absolutely perfectly eternally one. Everything you experience, the multiplicity of objects, the passage of time, the constant change and motion, all of it is illusion. The way things really are is nothing like the way they appear to be. And here's what makes this so philosophically powerful. Parmenides didn't arrive at this through mystical insight or religious revelation. He got here through pure logical deduction from one simple premise. Non-being is impossible. That's it. That's the whole argument. You can't have nothing. And from that one premise, rigorously applied, you get this vision of reality that seems to contradict everything we experience every moment of our lives. The logical trap. Now, you might be looking for the flaw in the argument. Where does Parmenides go wrong? And here's the thing. Philosophers have been looking for that flaw for 2,500 years, and it's not obvious where it is. You can't just say, but change obviously happens, because that's begging the question. That's assuming experience is reliable, which is exactly what's at issue. You can't just trust your senses against Parmenides' logic, because he's already explained why your senses deceive you. You have to find a flaw in the logical argument itself. You have to show where the reasoning breaks down. And that's really, really hard. Maybe the flaw is in the premise. Maybe non-being can exist in some sense. But what sense? How can nothing be something? Maybe the flaw is in how Parmenides applies the premise. Maybe there's a way to have change without invoking non-being. But how? What changes without something ceasing to be what it was? These are the questions that drove Plato and Aristotle crazy. These are the questions that still drive philosophers crazy today. Because Parmenides has set a trap. Either accept his conclusions or show exactly where his logic fails. And neither option is easy. So now you're probably thinking, okay, but I just watched my coffee get cold. I just saw the sun move across the sky. I'm literally experiencing change right now. What am I supposed to do with that? Which brings us to the biggest problem in Parmenides' philosophy. The problem that defines much of Western philosophy after him. The problem of appearance versus reality, of reason versus experience, of what to do when logic and life point in completely opposite directions. Alright, so we've just seen Parmenides use pure logic to prove that change is impossible, that reality is one, eternal, unchanging, indivisible. And now we need to confront the elephant in the room. The massive, glaring, impossible to ignore problem with this entire philosophy. You're experiencing change right now. Right this second. You're hearing these words unfold in time. You're thinking new thoughts. If you're drinking coffee, it's getting colder. If you're sitting, you might shift position. The sun is moving across the sky. Or the earth is rotating. Same difference. You're aging. Your heart is beating. Blood is flowing through your veins. Everything, and I mean everything about your lived experience tells you that change is real, that motion happens, that time passes, that there are many things, not just one thing. So what the hell is Parmenides doing? Is he just denying the obvious? Is this philosophy, or is this delusion? The way of opinion. Here's where we need to understand what Parmenides is actually claiming. He's not saying you're not experiencing what you think you're experiencing. He's saying that what you're experiencing isn't reality. It's appearance, it's opinion, it's doxa. Remember the structure of the poem? After the way of truth comes the way of opinion? And in that section, Parmenides describes the world of appearances. The world you and I inhabit every day. The world of sun and moon and stars, of hot and cold, of light and dark, of coming to be and passing away. But here's the crucial point. He's describing it as the world mortals believe in, the world that seems real to us, not the world as it actually is. Think of it like this. Imagine you're watching a movie. On the screen, you see characters moving, talking, changing, aging, dying. The story unfolds in time. Events happen, things change, but what's really there? Pixels on a screen, light and shadow. No actual motion, no actual change in the fundamental reality, just the appearance of motion, the illusion of change. Parmenides is saying our entire experience of reality is like that. We're watching the movie and thinking it's real. We're seeing the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. Oh wait, Plato hasn't written that yet, but you get the idea. We're experiencing appearance and mistaking it for reality. Deceptive appearances. But why? Why would our senses deceive us so completely? Why would reality appear so radically different from what it actually is? Parmenides doesn't give us a detailed answer to this question. And that's actually one of the puzzling things about his philosophy. He proves, to his satisfaction, that the sensory world is illusory, but he doesn't fully explain the mechanism of the illusion. Later philosophers will try to fill this gap. Plato will develop the theory of forms, the idea that there is a perfect unchanging realm of forms, and the physical world is just an imperfect changing copy. But Parmenides himself just draws the line. Reason shows us truth. Senses show us opinion. And when they conflict, reason wins. Always. This is a radical claim about epistemology, about how we know things. Parmenides is saying that genuine knowledge comes exclusively from reason, from logical deduction, from a priori thinking. The senses don't give us knowledge at all. They give us opinion, belief, appearance. And opinion is not knowledge, no matter how compelling it seems. The way of truth. So what does genuine knowledge look like? It looks like the logical argument we just went through. You start with a premise that must be true. Non-being is impossible. You follow the logical implications rigorously. You accept the conclusions even when they contradict experience. This is rationalism in its purest, most extreme form. Reason is the sole source of knowledge about reality. Experience is unreliable, deceptive, misleading. Trust the logic, not your eyes. Now I want you to feel the full force of this tension. Because this isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle. This is a crisis at the heart of how we understand ourselves and our world. On one hand, you have the testimony of your senses. Everything you've ever experienced tells you that change is real. You've watched people be born and die. You've seen seasons change. You've felt yourself grow in age. The evidence is overwhelming, constant, inescapable. On the other hand, you have this logical argument that seems airtight. Non-being is impossible, therefore change is impossible. The reasoning appears valid, the premises seem sound, and if the argument is valid and the premises are sound, the conclusion must be true. So which do you trust? Your experience or your reason? What you see or what you can prove? The fundamental tension. This is the question that drives Western philosophy for the next 2,500 years. This is the problem that Plato, Aristotle, and every subsequent philosopher has to grapple with. Some philosophers side with Parmenides. They say reason reveals reality, and we need to explain why experience is deceptive. Plato goes this route with the theory of forms. Descartes goes this route with his method of doubt. Rationalists generally go this route. Other philosophers push back. They say experience must count for something, and we need to find the flaw in Parmenides' argument, or develop new concepts that allow for change. Aristotle goes this route with potentiality and actuality. Empiricists generally go this route, but nobody, and I mean nobody, can just ignore Parmenides. You can't just say, obviously change happens, and walk away, because Parmenides has shown that obviously isn't good enough. You need to explain why change is possible despite his argument. You need to show where the reasoning breaks down. You need to do the philosophical work. And here's what's remarkable. When you really engage with Parmenides, when you take his argument seriously and try to refute it, you end up doing better philosophy. You're forced to think more carefully about what change means, what existence means, what the relationship between being and non-being could be. You're forced to develop more sophisticated concepts and more rigorous arguments. Parmenides is like a philosophical stress test. If your theory of reality can't handle his challenge, it's not robust enough. You need to go back and strengthen it. Making it personal. Let me bring this home to your own experience. Right now, as you're engaging with these ideas, you're experiencing something, you're thinking thoughts. Those thoughts are changing, you're moving from one idea to another. You're learning, which means you're changing from a state of not knowing to a state of knowing. According to Parmenides, none of that is really happening. The real you, the true being that you are, is eternal, unchanging, identical with all of reality. This experience of thinking, learning, changing, that's appearance. That's the movie on the screen. That's the shadow on the cave wall. Can you accept that? Can you really believe that your lived experience is fundamentally illusory? that nothing you've ever experienced is ultimately real? Most people can't. Most people, when push comes to shove, trust their experience over abstract logical arguments. And that's fine. That's a philosophical position. It's empiricism. It's the view that experience is a legitimate source of knowledge, that the senses can be trusted, at least to some degree. But if you take that position, you owe Parmenides an answer. You owe him an explanation of where his argument goes wrong. You can't just assert that change is real. You have to show why his proof that change is impossible fails. And that brings us to one of the deepest problems Parmenides raises. A problem that's not just about change or motion or the nature of reality. It's a problem about language, thought, and meaning itself. Now we're going to go even deeper, because embedded in Parmenides' argument is a problem that's so fundamental, so challenging, that it's still debated in philosophy of language, logic, and metaphysics today. It's the problem of non-being, the problem of negation, the problem of how we can think or talk about what doesn't exist. The problem of non-being. Here's the puzzle. When I say unicorns do not exist, what am I talking about? Think about that for a second. I'm making a claim about unicorns, specifically that they don't exist. But if they don't exist, then there's nothing there for me to be talking about. So what is my statement about? It can't be about nothing, because you can't make meaningful statements about nothing. Nothing is nothing. It has no properties, no characteristics, no features for me to describe or discuss. But it also can't be about something, because then unicorns would exist, which contradicts the very claim I'm making. So when I say unicorns do not exist, I seem to be caught in a paradox. I'm referring to something, unicorns, in order to say that there's nothing there to refer to. I'm thinking about non-being, which Parmenides says is impossible. False statements and meaning. This problem gets even worse when we think about false statements. Consider the sentence, "The current king of France is bald." France doesn't have a king right now, so this statement is false. But what makes it false? What is it about? It seems to be about the king of France. But there is no king of France, so it's about nothing. But how can a meaningful sentence be about nothing? Or consider, Santa Claus lives at the North Pole. False statement, right? But what makes it false? It's not that Santa Claus exists but doesn't live at the North Pole. It's that Santa Claus doesn't exist at all. But then what is the statement about? Parmenides would say, these statements are literally meaningless. You can't think or speak about what is not. When you try to say X does not exist, you're attempting to think about non-being, which is impossible. The statement fails to refer to anything, and therefore fails to be meaningful. The challenge to language. But here's the problem. We make negative statements all the time. We say things don't exist. We make false claims. We talk about fictional entities, past entities that no longer exist, future entities that don't yet exist. And these statements seem perfectly meaningful. Dinosaurs no longer exist. Meaningful statement, right? We all understand it. But according to Parmenides' strict logic, it's problematic. If dinosaurs no longer exist, they've passed into non-being. And you can't think or speak about non-being. I will have lunch tomorrow. Meaningful statement. But that lunch doesn't exist yet. It's not yet being. How can I think about it, plan for it, talk about it, if it's not? Parmenides has discovered something profound. There's a deep tension between how language works and what logic seems to require. Language appears to let us talk about non-being all the time, but logic suggests that non-being is unthinkable, unspeakable, impossible. Modern philosophy grapples with this. Now, you might think this is just ancient philosophical navel-gazing, but this problem anticipates some of the most important developments in modern philosophy. Bertrand Russell, in the early 20th century, developed his theory of descriptions specifically to handle this problem. When we say, the current king of France is bald, Russell argues we're not really referring to the king of France. We're making a complex claim that can be analyzed into parts. There exists something that is currently king of France. There's only one such thing, and that thing is bald. And this complex claim is false because the first part is false. There doesn't exist anything that's currently king of France. Russell's solution lets us make meaningful negative existential claims without having to refer to non-existent entities. We're not talking about the non-existent king of France. We're making a false claim about what exists. Gottlob Frege, another giant of modern logic, developed a different approach using his distinction between sense and reference. The current king of France has a sense, a meaning, a way of picking out what we're talking about, even though it has no reference, nothing it actually picks out in the world. These are sophisticated solutions to a problem Parmenides identified 2,500 years ago. The problem of how thought and language relate to reality, especially when we're thinking or talking about what doesn't exist. The meta-philosophical moment. Here's what I find most fascinating about this. Parmenides discovered that philosophy can't avoid thinking about its own tools. We use language to talk about reality. We use thought to understand existence. But what if language and thought themselves create illusions? What if the very structure of language misleads us about the structure of reality? When I say the table is brown, language suggests there's a subject, the table, and a property, brownness, that the subject has. But does reality actually have that structure? Or is that just how language works? When I say the ice became water, language suggests a process of change, something persisting through transformation. But does reality actually contain such processes? Or is that just how we talk? Parmenides is forcing us to question whether the structure of language matches the structure of reality. And that's a profoundly important philosophical question. It's a question about whether we can trust our linguistic and conceptual frameworks to reveal truth, or whether they might systematically mislead us. The enduring challenge. This problem, the problem of non-being, of negation, of how we can meaningfully think and talk about what doesn't exist, this problem is still alive in contemporary philosophy. Philosophy of language debates how reference works, how meaning is determined, how we can make true statements about fictional or non-existent entities. Metaphysics debates what kinds of things exist, whether there are degrees of existence, whether possible but non-actual things have some kind of being. Logic debates how to formalize negative statements, how to handle empty names, how to develop systems that can accommodate talk about non-being without contradiction. All of this traces back to Parmenides. All of this is part of his legacy. He identified a fundamental puzzle about the relationship between thought, language, and reality, and we're still working on it. The philosophical vertigo. I want you to sit with this for a moment. Really feel the vertigo of it. You think thoughts. You use language. You make statements about reality. You distinguish true from false, real from unreal, what exists from what doesn't exist. But Parmenides is asking, can you really do that? Can you really think about what doesn't exist? Can you really speak meaningfully about non-being? Or is the very attempt incoherent, impossible, a fundamental category mistake? And if you can't think about non-being, then you can't think about change. Because change requires things to cease to be. You can't think about plurality, because that requires boundaries where being is not. You can't think about the past or future, because those are times when present things are not. You're trapped in an eternal unchanging now, and any attempt to think your way out just uses the very conceptual tools, language, thought, negation, that might be creating the trap in the first place. This is philosophy at its most vertiginous, most challenging, most unsettling. This is what happens when you take logical reasoning seriously and follow it wherever it leads, even into places that seem to undermine the very possibility of thought itself. And just when you think it can't get any more challenging, just when you're ready to throw up your hands and say, "This is impossible, this is absurd," there must be something wrong with this whole approach. Parmenides' student Zeno shows up with a set of paradoxes that make everything even worse. Because Zeno is going to show that if you don't like Parmenides' conclusions, if you want to insist that motion and plurality are real, you face contradictions and absurdities of your own. Okay, so imagine you're living in ancient Greece, and this guy Parmenides has just blown everyone's mind by claiming that change and motion are impossible. And predictably, everyone thinks he's lost it. Obviously, things move. Obviously, change happens. I can see it with my own eyes. And that's when Zeno of Elea, Parmenides' devoted student, steps up with what might be the most brilliant defensive move in the history of philosophy, the defender's strategy. Zeno doesn't try to make Parmenides' conclusions sound more palatable. He doesn't soften the claims or find a middle ground. Instead, he does something far more clever. He shows that if you reject Parmenides, if you insist that motion and plurality are real, you end up with contradictions and absurdities of your own. It's a classic reductio ad absurdum argument. Reduction to absurdity. Zeno says, "You think Parmenides is crazy for denying motion? Fine. Let's assume motion is real and see what happens. Let's assume plurality is real and see where that leads." Spoiler alert, it leads to logical impossibilities. This is philosophical judo. Instead of defending his position directly, Zeno attacks yours. He shows that common sense, the view that motion and plurality are obviously real, leads to paradoxes just as troubling as anything Parmenides claimed. And here's what makes this so effective. You can't just laugh off Zeno's paradoxes. You can't just say, obviously Achilles catches the tortoise and walk away. Because Zeno has shown that if you accept the premises that seem obvious to you, that space is divisible, that time passes, that motion involves traversing distances, you get logical contradictions. So now you're stuck. Accept Parmenides and deny motion, or accept motion and face Zeno's paradoxes. Pick your poison. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Let me walk you through the most famous one. Achilles, the swift-footed hero, is racing a tortoise. Being a good sport, Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. Let's say the tortoise starts 100 meters ahead. Now Achilles is fast. Let's say he runs 10 times faster than the tortoise. So when Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise started, that 100-meter mark, the tortoise has moved ahead 10 meters. Okay, so Achilles runs to that new point, 10 meters ahead. But in the time it takes him to get there, the tortoise has moved forward 1 meter. Achilles runs to that point. The tortoise moves forward 0.1 meters. Achilles runs to that point. The tortoise moves forward 0.01 meters. You see the pattern? Every time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved a little bit farther ahead. The distances get smaller and smaller, 10 meters, 1 meter, 0.1 meters, 0.01 meters, but they never reach 0. So Achilles never catches the tortoise. He gets closer and closer, but there's always another tiny distance to cover, and in the time it takes to cover that distance, the tortoise moves a tiny bit farther. Now obviously this is absurd. Obviously Achilles catches the tortoise. We know from experience that faster things overtake slower things, but Zeno has given you a logical argument that says it's impossible. And the question is, where does the argument go wrong? The dichotomy paradox. Or try this one. You want to walk across a room. To get to the other side, you first have to get halfway across. Fair enough, but before you can get halfway across, you have to get a quarter of the way across. And before that, an eighth of the way. And before that, a 16th. In fact, before you can cover any distance at all, you have to cover half that distance. But before you can cover half that distance, you have to cover half of that. And so on, infinitely. So to move any distance at all, you'd have to complete an infinite number of tasks, crossing infinite subdivisions of space. But you can't complete an infinite number of tasks in finite time. So motion is impossible. You can't even start walking across the room. Again, obviously absurd. Obviously you can walk across a room, you do it all the time. But where's the flaw in the reasoning? The arrow paradox. Here's another one, and this one's particularly clever. Consider an arrow in flight. At any given instant, any single moment in time. Where is the arrow? It's at some specific location, right? At this instant, the arrow occupies exactly this much space and no more. At this instant, it's here, not there. But if it's at a specific location at this instant, it's not moving at this instant. Motion means changing location, but at a single instant, there's no time for change. At any given instant, the arrow is stationary, but the arrow's flight is just a series of instants. And if the arrow is stationary at every instant, how does it ever move? How does a series of stationary states add up to motion? Think about it like a film strip. Each frame shows the arrow at a fixed position. The arrow isn't moving in any individual frame. So how does running the frames together create motion? Where does the motion come from if it's not in any of the individual moments? Deepening the challenge. Now here's what's so brilliant about what Zeno is doing. He's not just defending Parmenides, he's deepening the philosophical challenge. He's showing that the problem isn't just Parmenides' weird conclusions. The problem is that our ordinary concepts of space, time, and motion lead to paradoxes. If space is infinitely divisible, you get the dichotomy paradox. You can't complete an infinite number of tasks. If time is made of instants, you get the arrow paradox. Motion disappears when you look at individual moments. If you think faster things overtake slower things by covering the distance between them, you get Achilles and the tortoise. The faster thing never catches up. These aren't just tricks or wordplay. These are genuine logical puzzles that arise from taking seriously the concepts we use to understand motion and change. And they suggest that maybe, just maybe, Parmenides was onto something when he said motion is impossible. The philosophical pressure. What Zeno has done is shift the burden of proof. It's not enough to just say Parmenides is obviously wrong because I can see things moving. You have to explain how motion is possible given these paradoxes. You have to show where Zeno's reasoning breaks down. And that's really hard. Philosophers and mathematicians struggled with these paradoxes for over 2,000 years. Aristotle tried to solve them. Medieval philosophers tried. It wasn't until the development of calculus and modern mathematics, the concept of limits, the understanding of infinite series, that we got tools to address them properly. And even then, there's debate about whether we've really solved the paradoxes or just developed mathematical techniques that let us work around them. Some philosophers argue that Zeno's paradoxes reveal genuine problems with our concepts of continuity, infinity, and change. The lasting impact. Here's what I want you to appreciate. Zeno's paradoxes aren't just historical curiosities. They're not just ancient brain teasers that we've moved past. They remain influential across multiple fields. In philosophy, they force us to think carefully about the nature of infinity, continuity, and change. They show that our intuitive concepts can lead to contradictions when pushed to their logical limits. In mathematics, they motivated the development of rigorous approaches to infinity and infinitesimals. The calculus that Newton and Leibniz developed is, in part, a response to problems Zeno identified. In physics, they raise questions about the nature of space and time. Is space continuous or discrete? Is time made of indivisible instants, or is it a continuum? These are live questions in quantum mechanics and theories of quantum gravity. The method matters. But beyond the specific paradoxes, what Zeno demonstrates is a method, the method of finding contradictions in your opponent's position, of showing that they're obvious. Assumptions lead to absurd conclusions. This becomes a central tool in philosophy. Socrates uses it constantly in Plato's dialogues. Skeptics use it to undermine dogmatic claims. Critical philosophers use it to expose hidden assumptions. Zeno shows that you can't just appeal to common sense or obvious experience. You have to be able to defend your position against logical challenges. You have to be able to explain how your view avoids contradiction. The uncomfortable truth. And here's the uncomfortable truth that Zeno forces us to face. Maybe common sense isn't as reliable as we think. Maybe the obvious truth that things move and change is actually deeply problematic when you examine it closely. This doesn't mean Parmenides is right. It doesn't mean motion really is impossible. But it does mean that if you want to defend the reality of motion and change, you've got serious philosophical work to do. You can't just point at the world and say, look, things move. You have to grapple with the paradoxes. You have to develop concepts sophisticated enough to handle infinity, continuity, and change without contradiction. You have to do philosophy, not just assert experience. And that's exactly what happens. Zeno's paradoxes drive philosophical and mathematical development for millennia. They force thinkers to develop better, more rigorous, more sophisticated ways of understanding reality. So in a weird way, Zeno's defense of Parmenides, even if you ultimately reject Parmenides' conclusions, makes philosophy better. It raises the bar. It shows that you can't get away with sloppy thinking or unexamined assumptions. It demands rigor, precision, logical coherence. And that legacy, that insistence on rigorous argument, on logical consistency, on not just accepting what seems obvious, that's one of Parmenides and Zeno's greatest contributions to Western thought. But now we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. We need to see how later philosophers responded to this challenge, how they tried to preserve change and plurality while avoiding both Parmenides' denial of motion and Zeno's paradoxes. And we need to understand why 2,500 years later we're still wrestling with the questions these two Eleatic philosophers raised. Alright, so we've been on quite a journey. We've seen Parmenides use pure logic to deny change and motion. We've seen Zeno defend him with paradoxes that seem to show motion leads to contradictions. And now we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. We're not entirely sure what Parmenides meant, and we're definitely not sure whether he was right. The monism debate. What did Parmenides really claim? Here's the first big interpretative challenge. Was Parmenides a strict monist who believed in literally only one thing, with absolutely no internal differentiation? Or was his position more nuanced? Some scholars read Parmenides as an absolute monist. Reality is one. Period. No parts, no properties, no distinctions of any kind. Just pure, undifferentiated being. On this reading, everything we experience, all the multiplicity, all the diversity, all the different objects and properties, is complete illusion. But other scholars argue this is too extreme. They point out that even Parmenides has to use language, has to make distinctions, has to talk about being as having certain characteristics, eternal, indivisible, etc. Maybe he's not denying all distinctions, just denying that things can come into being or pass out of being. Maybe he's making a more limited claim about change and generation, not about all plurality. And honestly, we don't know for sure. The poem is fragmentary, we don't have the complete text. It's written in archaic Greek with ambiguous phrasing. It uses poetic language that might be metaphorical or might be literal. Scholars have been debating this for over 2 millennia, and there's no consensus. What we do know is that Parmenides' argument was radical enough to shock his contemporaries and force every subsequent philosopher to respond to it. Whether he meant the most extreme version or something more moderate, he clearly challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The cosmology puzzle. Why describe the world of appearance? Here's the second big puzzle. After spending all this effort proving that the sensory world is illusory, why does Parmenides then provide a detailed cosmology of that illusory world? Remember, the poem has 3 parts: the proem, the way of truth, and the way of opinion. And in the way of opinion, Parmenides describes the physical cosmos, the sun, moon, stars, the structure of the heavens, how things seem to work in the world of appearances. Why would he do this? Several theories. Theory 1. He's showing what the best possible account of the deceptive world would look like. If you insist on believing your senses, here's the most coherent story you can tell. But remember, it's still just opinion, not truth. Theory 2. He's demonstrating the limits of mortal understanding. This is how humans naturally think about the world, but it's fundamentally mistaken. The cosmology illustrates the trap we fall into when we trust experience over reason. Theory 3. Maybe the cosmology isn't meant to be entirely false. Perhaps there's some relationship between the way of truth and the way of opinion that we don't fully understand. Maybe the sensory world is a kind of appearance of the one, not completely unreal, but not ultimately real either. Theory 4. Some scholars think the cosmology might not even be Parmenides' own view. Maybe he's reporting what others believe or what the goddess tells him mortals believe, to contrast it with the truth. Again, we don't have a definitive answer. The text is ambiguous, and ancient sources give conflicting interpretations. This is one of those cases where the historical distance and fragmentary evidence leave us with genuine uncertainty about what the philosopher intended. Plato's wrestling match. But here's what we do know. Parmenides' challenge was so profound that it dominated Greek philosophy for generations. And nowhere is this more evident than in Plato's work. Plato wrote an entire dialogue called the Parmenides, and it's one of the most difficult, most perplexing dialogues he ever wrote. In it, a young Socrates meets an elderly Parmenides and gets absolutely demolished in argument. Parmenides shows that Plato's theory of forms, the idea of eternal, unchanging forms that physical things participate in, faces serious logical problems. It's remarkable. Plato is using Parmenides as a character to critique Plato's own philosophy. He's showing that even the theory of forms, which was partly developed to address Parmenides' challenge, doesn't fully escape the problems Parmenides raised. Then in the Sophist, Plato tackles the problem of non-being directly. He argues that we need to commit what he calls parricide. We need to kill the father, Parmenides, by showing that non-being can exist in some sense. Specifically, Plato argues that not being doesn't mean absolute nothingness. It means being different from. When we say the table is not a chair, we're not invoking absolute non-being. We're saying the table is different from a chair. This is a sophisticated response. Plato is trying to preserve Parmenides' insight that absolute nothingness is impossible while creating conceptual space for difference, change, and plurality. He's threading the needle between Parmenides' monism and common sense pluralism. But even Plato admits this is difficult. The problems Parmenides raised don't have easy solutions. They require developing new concepts, new distinctions, new ways of thinking about being and non-being. Aristotle's alternative. Aristotle takes a different approach. He's less reverent toward Parmenides than Plato was, more willing to say, look, change obviously happens, so there must be something wrong with the argument. But Aristotle doesn't just dismiss Parmenides. He develops sophisticated concepts specifically to address the Eleatic challenge, potentiality and actuality. Things can exist potentially before they exist actually. Ice is actually solid but potentially liquid. When it melts, it isn't going from being to non-being. It's going from potential liquidity to actual liquidity. The potential was already there, already real in some sense, so change doesn't require something to come from nothing. Substance and accidents. The substance, the underlying thing, persists through change, while the accidents, the properties, change. When coffee gets cold, the substance, the coffee, remains. But the accident, hotness, is replaced by another accident, coldness. So there's continuity through change, four causes. Aristotle develops a complex theory of causation, material, formal, efficient, final, to explain how change happens without invoking absolute non-being. These moves let us make sense of change without falling into Parmenides' trap. Potentiality and actuality become central to Western philosophy and theology for the next 2,000 years. Notice what Aristotle had to do. He built an entirely new metaphysical framework just to answer Parmenides. That shows how powerful Parmenides' argument was. Modern relevance, the questions remain. Live. Now you might think, okay, Plato and Aristotle solved it. Problem solved, right? Not quite. The fundamental questions Parmenides raised are still live philosophical problems. Metaphysics. What is the relationship between being and non-being? Can things come into existence from nothing? How can something change while remaining the same thing? Philosophy of language. How do we refer to non-existent things? How can false statements be meaningful? What's the relationship between language and reality? Logic. How do we formalize negative statements? How do we handle empty names in terms that don't refer to anything? Philosophy of time. Is the present moment all that exists? Do past and future things have being? How can things persist through time? Philosophy of mind. How can we think about what doesn't exist? What's the relationship between thought and reality? Contemporary philosophers are still working on these issues, still developing new theories, still engaging with Parmenides and trying to locate, if anywhere, where he went wrong. The enduring challenge. What's remarkable about Parmenides is that he identified problems so deep that we're still grappling with them 2,500 years later. He isn't just a historical footnote. He's an active participant in ongoing debates. Whenever modern philosophers discuss time, existence, or the logic of negation, they invoke Parmenides. He's a permanent fixture in the philosophical landscape, a mountain every philosopher must climb, navigate around, or find a path through. What we've learned. Philosophy is hard. The deepest questions lack easy answers, and sometimes we're not even sure we're asking the right ones. Historical distance creates challenges. Interpreting 2,500-year-old fragments in an ancient language inevitably leaves uncertainty. Problems outlive their original formulations. Even if we're unsure of Parmenides' exact stance, the puzzles he raised are real and enduring. Engaging with tough arguments improves thinking. Parmenides forces rigor and logical precision. We can't be sloppy when confronting his challenge. Philosophy is a conversation across time. Parmenides speaks to Plato, Plato to Aristotle, Aristotle to medieval thinkers to modern ones, and all of them to us. We are part of that ongoing dialogue. Parmenides started something that hasn't ended. That may be the highest compliment a philosopher can receive, not that he got everything right, but that he asked questions so profound we're still trying to answer them. All right, we've been deep in ancient arguments and paradoxes, and you might be wondering, why should I care about some ancient Greek philosopher who claimed motion is impossible? What does this have to do with anything practical? Fair question. Let me tell you why Parmenides matters, not just as historical curiosity, but as a living force in how we think. From myth to method, the birth of rational inquiry. Parmenides represents a pivotal moment in human intellectual history. He transformed philosophy from mythological storytelling into rigorous inquiry based on logical proof. Before him, you explained the world through stories. Zeus did this, the Titans did that. Beautiful stories, but not arguments. Parmenides said, no, we're going to use reason. Start with premises, follow logical steps, accept conclusions even if they contradict experience. This is revolutionary. This is the birth of rational inquiry as we know it, the moment humans start trusting logic over tradition, reason over revelation. Everything after builds on this. Science, mathematics, philosophy. When Galileo argues the earth moves despite what our senses tell us, he's walking in Parmenides' footsteps. When Einstein uses thought experiments to derive relativity, he's using Parmenides' method. When any scientist says the data shows X, even though it's counterintuitive, they're making Parmenides' move, trusting reason over immediate experience. Reason over senses, the foundation of scientific thinking. His radical insistence that reason trumps sensory experience laid the foundation for both rationalist philosophy and scientific methodology. Wait, you're thinking, science is based on observation. How can Parmenides, who denied the senses, be foundational? Here's the thing. Science uses reason to interpret observations, developing theories that often contradict immediate experience. Your senses say the earth is flat. Science says it's a sphere. Your senses say solid objects are continuous. Science says they're mostly empty space. Your senses say time flows uniformly. Science says it's relative. Quantum mechanics is the perfect example. Particles in multiple places at once, superposition, entanglement. None of this matches sensory experience. But the mathematics works, so we accept it. That's Parmenides' legacy, the willingness to follow reason into strange places, to accept conclusions that seem absurd if the logic demands it. Enduring paradoxes, problems that drive progress. Through Zeno's paradoxes, Parmenides challenges fundamental assumptions in ways that still influence mathematics, physics, and logic. Zeno's paradoxes weren't fully addressed until calculus in the 17th century. And philosophers still debate whether we've solved them or just developed workarounds. They forced rigorous thinking about infinity and limits that underlies modern mathematics. In physics, Parmenides' questions remain live issues. Is time continuous or discrete? Does space-time have smallest units? These aren't abstract. They're central to quantum gravity research. In logic and language, his problem about non-being remains central. How do we handle reference to non-existent entities? These questions drive current research in formal semantics and modal logic. Questioning reality, the critical thinking skill. Most importantly, understanding Parmenides equips you to critically examine what you consider real versus mere appearance, essential to philosophy, science, and thoughtful living. We all make assumptions about reality. Usually we don't examine them. We accept them because they seem obvious, because everyone else does, because they match experience. Parmenides teaches you to question that, to ask, what if the obvious is wrong? What if my most basic assumptions are mistaken? This is crucial critical thinking. It lets you question social constructs treated as natural, recognize cultural assumptions passed off as universal truths, distinguish appearance from reality, think independently. People once thought slavery was natural, women intellectually inferior, Earth the center of the universe. These seemed obvious to intelligent people. What changed? People started questioning the frameworks themselves, using reason to challenge assumptions. That's the Parmenidean move. Radical questioning, willingness to follow logic wherever it leads, courage to challenge basic assumptions. The method and the challenge Parmenides gives you a toolkit. Start with clear premises. Follow implications rigorously. Accept counterintuitive conclusions if the logic is sound. When reason and experience conflict, examine both carefully. And he represents a permanent challenge to complacency. You think you understand reality? Prove it. You think your senses are reliable? Show why. You trust common sense? Common sense once said the earth was flat. This is uncomfortable. It's meant to be. Philosophy should disturb, unsettle, make you question what you thought you knew. Why this matters now. We live in a world of competing truth claims, alternative facts, post-truth politics. We're told to trust our gut, follow feelings, believe what feels right. Parmenides offers an antidote: rigorous reasoning, logical consistency, willingness to follow arguments wherever they lead. Truth isn't about what feels right or matches experience, it's about what must be true given sound premises and valid reasoning. In an age of confusion about truth, Parmenides reminds us that logic matters, that arguments need to be sound, that we can't just believe whatever we want. In an age of intellectual laziness, he reminds us that deep questions are hard, that real understanding requires serious work, that truth doesn't come cheap. So yes, Parmenides matters. Not because he was right about everything, he probably wasn't, but because he showed us how to think rigorously, question deeply, pursue truth fearlessly. And that's a skill we need now more than ever. We've come a long way. We started with a cosmic chariot ride and ended up grappling with the deepest questions in philosophy. What is real? What can we know? Should we trust reason or experience? Let me show you why this ancient philosopher's radical vision still speaks to us across 2,500 years. Beyond the flux. Parmenides invites us to see beyond life's constant flux to the unchanging essence he believed lies beneath all appearances, a reality accessible only through pure reason. Everything around you seems to be changing, light shifting, sounds fading, thoughts flowing. Heraclitus said, "You can't step in the same river twice. Everything flows." But Parmenides says, "Look deeper. Use reason, not senses. What you're seeing is appearance, not reality. Beneath all this change is something unchanging, eternal, being itself." Whether he's right is debatable. We've been debating it for millennia, but the invitation is profound. Look beyond surface appearances. Question whether what we experience is what's ultimately real. Use our minds to penetrate deeper. This applies everywhere. In ethics, look beyond surface intuitions to deeper principles. In politics, look beyond how systems appear to how they actually function. In personal life, look beyond immediate reactions to deeper truths. Parmenides teaches us to be seekers, not just acceptors. Questioners, not just believers. A timeless meditation. Think about what he accomplished. With no scientific instruments, no advanced mathematics, no philosophical tradition to build on, Parmenides asked, what does it mean for something to exist? From that one question, pursued with absolute logical rigor, he derived a complete metaphysical system. He showed philosophy could be rigorous, logical, demonstrative. It could prove things, not just suggest them. He identified problems we're still working on: non-being, change, the relationship between thought and reality, the tension between reason and experience. Through Zeno, he created paradoxes that drove mathematical development for over 2 millennia. He forced every subsequent philosopher to respond: Plato, Aristotle, medieval thinkers, modern rationalists, contemporary metaphysicians. That's the mark of a truly great philosopher. Not that everyone agrees, but that everyone must engage. What is, what is not, is not. This deceptively simple statement contains radical implications that continue to inspire and perplex thinkers 2,500 years later. Seems obvious, right? Almost trivial. But Parmenides shows that rigorously applied, it revolutionizes our understanding of reality. If what is not cannot be, then nothing can come from nothing. Change is impossible. Motion is impossible. Plurality is impossible. From one simple premise, an entire metaphysical revolution. And you can't easily dismiss this. Parmenides has given you an argument. If you want to reject the conclusion, you have to show where the reasoning fails. That's hard. Really hard. That's why philosophers are still working on it. The challenge for you. Next time you experience change, watching a sunset, having a conversation, aging another day, ask yourself, is this real or is this appearance? I'm not saying accept Parmenides' answer, but take the question seriously. What would it take to prove that change is real? How do you know? Not how does it feel, but how do you know? What's your argument? This is what Parmenides teaches. Don't just accept what seems obvious, think it through, examine your assumptions, follow the logic. When you really engage with his challenge, something remarkable happens. You don't just learn about ancient philosophy, you become a philosopher yourself. You start doing philosophy, not just studying it. The ongoing conversation. This isn't just history. This is an ongoing conversation about existence, truth, and knowledge that you're now part of. Parmenides asked, "What does it mean for something to exist?" That question is still open. Your thoughts can contribute to this conversation spanning millennia, joining Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, and contemporary metaphysicians in humanity's ongoing attempt to understand reality's fundamental nature. Philosophy offers not final answers but participation in the deepest conversations humans can have. Not certainty but tools to think rigorously about uncertainty. Not comfort, but courage to follow truth wherever it leads. Final reflection. Parmenides forces us to justify our most basic beliefs about reality. That's exactly what philosophy should do. It should make us uncomfortable, challenge our assumptions, force us to think harder, reason more carefully, examine more deeply. It should show us that what seems obvious might not be true, that reality might be radically different from how it appears. Whether you ultimately agree with Parmenides or find flaws in his reasoning, engaging with his philosophy makes you a better thinker. It sharpens your mind, deepens your understanding, expands your capacity for rational thought. And in a world that desperately needs clear thinking, rigorous reasoning, and intellectual courage, that's a gift worth receiving. Thank you, Parmenides, for asking the hardest questions, for following logic into uncomfortable places, for showing us that philosophy can be rigorous, demanding, transformative. The deepest questions, what exists, what is real, what can we know, are always worth asking, always worth pursuing, always worth thinking about with everything we've got. The question of being remains eternal, and so does the invitation to think deeply about it.